Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is game 27 from the 1984-85 World Chess Championship match between Karpov and Kasparov. This was the aborted match, aborted ultimately after 48 games. And prior to this game, Karpov was really in the driver's seat, having won 4 games to Kasparov's 0. And also worth mentioning, there were a string of 17 consecutive draws prior to this game 27. Let's have a look and see what took place in this game. Karpov had white and opened with knight f3, d5 by Kasparov, and we have a queen's gambit declined. Keep in mind the style of both players. Karpov the more strategic, Kasparov the more dynamic, tactical, and that will influence the decisions, of course, by both players, especially in the opening. After h6, we have Karpov investing the bishop pair in exchange for what? When we look at the pawn structure, we're going to notice, especially on the king side, that it's fairly static and there will not be a great deal of dynamism in the position, or at least on the king side. What we will soon see take shape is action on the queen side, but it will be quickly resolved, and we will essentially be working with just half the chessboard, namely the queen side of the board. So let's see that. After e3, castles, queen c2, c5, this is as dynamic as this whole game gets. This is where there is the most tension in the position. But it's quickly resolved. After queen a5, the knight's in a pin, castles, and that earlier investment of the bishop pair by Karpov is now returned. We have Kasparov grabbing on c3, giving up the bishop pair in exchange for what? Well, in this case, in exchange for damaging the white pawn structure. After knight d7, this pawn plus, it's not a very healthy pawn, but it's still a pawn plus. The pawn plus that Karpov has will be, well, it'll be restored. The material will be restored in this game. And there's some criteria we could really look into in any chess game, any position, and now is a good moment to look at that criteria. There's material, there's space, time, pawn structure, and king safety. All big factors in the game. Which ones are relevant in this game? Which ones are relevant in this position? If we look at material, we could essentially forget about that because it will be restored. There's not going to be a way to defend this pawn. Material will not be much of a factor. Space. Does either side have a pawn positioned in one another's territory? No. So space will not be irrelevant. If you wanted to be a little bit more pedantic about the space factor, you could maybe say to yourself, if you want to be a little bit more technical about it, you could say or think, is any one of my pawns in a position to maybe be placed in my opponent's position? And, well, I don't really see that happening in this position, especially when there's no queens on the board. That's usually much more of a factor. A space advantage is usually much more of a factor if the queens are on the board and you're looking to use that space advantage to attack. We're not really going to have this great attack going on. It's a much more technical position. Time is actually a factor in this one because white is already fully developed, whereas black, not the case. This bishop still has to move. This knight still has to move before the bishop can move. Time will be a factor. There's also the pawn structure. Well, as it stands right now, if white makes, let's say, a rook to b1 move, getting on a half-open file, the pawn structure will actually be tipping in black's favor. These are two perfectly healthy pawns versus these. That would be tipping in black's favor. And lastly, we have king safety. That's not going to be an issue. Neither side's king is in trouble. So, well, if this is the one factor that's in favor of white, having a time advantage, maybe there's a way to give up a little bit of that time. Maybe there's a way to waste time in exchange for what? In exchange for damaging the black pawn structure. That right there is maybe your cue. If you go through that list, maybe that's your cue to know that c6 would be a very good move and was the move played in this game. what is it doing? It's investing some time in exchange for damaging the black pawn structure. And we're still now in a position where white maintains a slight time advantage, and that is the only factor that really is showing up in this game. And so the big question will be, how can Karpov put to use the lead in time and maybe convert that into a material plus? So let's see how things take shape. We have first the rook playing to an open file. Knight b6 gives the bishop a kick, and bishop to e2. There's also bishop to b3. That might be one of those knee-jerk type of reactions. You back up and you're still watching over these knight moves, but it doesn't address the potential placement of this bishop. Bishop a6 could be quite annoying, and this is a nice square that can maybe be used by the black pieces. So it's bishop to e2. Staying on a closed file, you don't want to play to d3 because you're accessible to a rook. So you can still just tuck yourself behind, stay on a closed file, in other words, and still watch over a6. And so the bishop, as a result, is going to have to play to either b7 or d7. Soon enough, we'll see him play to b7 to take up a post on d5 and put pressure on a weak link, the a2 pawn. So following up, we have rook f to c1. May seem a little bit awkward. This is an open file, and white is moving to a closed file. Why exactly? Well, it's an anticipatory move. Anticipating what? It's anticipating knight a4, putting pressure on this pawn. And it's also vacating f1 because this is an endgame. The king wants to play an active role. Bishop b7, king f1, bishop d5, and now rook to b5. This pawn is immune from capture. Well, if it's captured initially, I thought, well, you take this pawn, you could grab here, but it's actually much worse for black because this bishop's now quite short on squares. Its only safe square is to go back to the square it came from, d5, but that can be interfered with c4, and after rook b2, he's dead. So this is a poison pawn, in other words. You can't take on a2. This pawn is, the pawn threat is addressed with knight d7, and now rook to a5. This is a very, very active piece. Really can't act, or you really can't ask more of a piece. It's there to defend. It's there to put pressure on the two weak pawns on black's queenside. So rook to b8, rook f to b8. c5 is there, kicking the bishop from the strong post and making sure that this weak pawn on c5 remains static. It's immobile. Bishop c6, and now comes knight to e1. We see the idea here. It's to put pressure on the c5 pawn. These are the two pawns that are weak, c5 and a7. It's the c5 pawn, however, that is more accessible to the white pieces. So knight e1, the intention is knight d3, and that pawn will be scooped up. So rook to b4 is played for what reason exactly? After rook to b4, how does that interfere with knight to d3? This may very well still be a good move, but Karpov did not want to allow this reply, rook a4, where the black side would be able to exchange off the very good white rook on a5. A follow-up could still be to essentially replenish the rook, replace that rook that was on a5 by playing to c3, a3, but it was just a more restrictive type of move played at this moment right here for this move 23. It wasn't knight d3, but first a retreating move, bishop to d1, interfering with rook to a4. Karpov wants to keep this very active rook on the board. So now comes anticipating knight to d3. We have the rook backing up, staying on the 7th rank. And now f3, which seems a little bit curious. Why isn't Karpov running right in for that c5 pawn? Let's take a quick look at that. If the knight runs in too quickly, we would have bishop e4. Yes, you win a pawn as white, but now there's a super active rook and maybe yet another that could enter the scene on white's 2nd rank. This could be a little bit annoying. So it's a restrictive move yet again, just like bishop d1 preventing that rook to a4 move. There's now f3, which is preventing bishop to e4. So now comes rook to d8. In comes knight d3. This pawn is hit twice, defended once. It will be won soon. How soon exactly? Well, first g5, looking to grab some kingside space, maybe even get the king up in this direction. and we don't have this capture right away. This pawn is not going to go anywhere, this pawn on c5, and so first just getting another piece involved, getting the bishop to b3, that would certainly rule out any potential invasion on white's second rank with rook to b2. So bishop to b3 it is. Here comes king f8, and now knight takes pawn. I thought to myself at this point, just like Karpov played bishop to b3 at this moment, improving one of the pieces before capturing on c5, I thought to myself, why not do the same with the king by playing to e2, but there's maybe some tactical issue involved by having the king on e2 opposed to f1. And the point I'm getting at is that after something like rook to c7, maybe now you're not able to grab that pawn so easily. Right? This would be tactically flawed now, since the bishop can now make a move with check to the white king. Whereas if he just remains on f1 during this capture on c5, when the white king is still on this f1 square, when this capture happens, there's not going to be a bishop move to give check to the white king. So that's why we have the immediate capture on c5 at this moment, instead of looking to improve ever so slightly before this pawn's capture. So it is, knight takes pawn, captures, and then after that we have what? We have king to e2. Just getting the king more active. Rook d7 was played to defend that bishop. King to e7, just getting the kings active at this point. Very technical phase. White is up a pawn at this point and still looking to convert well. So the rook back to that a5 square. Now comes some more space gaining moves, getting these pawns rolling, inching a little bit closer, hoping one day that one of these pawns could be picked up, and then one of the black pawns will be that much closer to queening. So king back, he was only there to recapture the rook on d1. So king e2, here comes more space gaining moves, and really what more can you do as black? There's not a way to improve the rook position or the bishop position, so it's just inching these pawns a little bit closer to queening again. That's anticipating some eventual capture down the road. So h5 it is, and now this is an opportunity for Karpov to strike at the black pawn structure. This is tying in well. Again, it's hard to imagine a much more active position for this white rook. It's pressure here. Earlier it had that idea of defending a2, but now look at the lateral movement and lateral influence it has on the position, this fifth rank. So e4 ties in well with the rook on a5. Takes. Rook is going to now grab on that g5 square. After that sequence of moves, no side won material. Karpov didn't win material, but this rook remains still very active, and bishop to f5 is now there to meet this move. This would not be a good idea for white to be grabbing that pawn. So bishop f5 defends this pawn indirectly. King e3 is now threatening to pick up this pawn. It's now moved. And now we're looking at king position. That's another factor we could kind of look at as the position becomes more simplified. The kings like to be in the center. This king is slightly more active than the black king on d6. So black interferes with this, gives the white king a kick. He has to go back to c3. This is the passed pawn. This is the one that white really would like to get rolling, but it's not so easy to control that c5 square. You can't get this king to b4 and push that pawn so easily. So bishop to b1, the pawn is hit. Just play a3, getting out of harm's way so that this bishop is freed up to go elsewhere if need be. Now comes rook to e7. This pawn is maybe getting ready to roll. Rook to g4 attacks this pawn, and we have h3 at this point. This pawn could be captured, but Karpov wants to keep this structure as is, playing g3, and maybe one day this pawn could be picked up. Keep in mind that if this pawn tries to run at this point, if black says, you know what, I don't care about my pawn, I'm just going to start pushing, keep in mind that white would be in time to play bishop d1, e3, bishop to e2, and he's there just in the nick of time to stop this pawn from advancing any further, and there's now a significant drawback by doing a premature pawn advance like that. Namely, it's the d4 square. You give that square up, and you can be sure that the white king will be making use of that nice central dark post, that d4 square, soon enough. So if this pawn advance cannot be played successfully right to its end, to a point where white would have to give up the bishop, then it's not worthwhile to move it at all because of the big square that you would be giving up to the white side. Again, the d4 square. So it is instead h3, g3. Black unfortunately has to just wait. Not a good position to be in, but rook to g7 hits this pawn, and now we have a little bit of a race. The Karpov's going after the a pawn. Black is going to now grab that h2 pawn, and we do see that. And now keep in mind, this pawn is just 2 steps away, but that rook earlier, when it was on b7, what was it doing? It was stopping the king from making use of b4 so that white could get this pawn advancing. So while black goes after this pawn here, what does white do? White gets in a position to finally advance this furthest advanced passed pawn. There's now 2 passed pawns, but this is the one you really want to get rolling, especially since it could be coming with tempo. So rook takes pawn, c5 comes. We inconvenience that black king with a couple checks, and this pawn continues to march. Can it be tracked down? Check, king a5, the rook has to come back, c7. Black is completely tied down, unfortunately, at this point, and it's not going to be savable. We have the bishop there to watch over any potential promotion on h1. If need be, the rook can maybe be playing over here to this h7 square. Not for right now, since the bishop is controlling it, but if black tries to, let's say, at this point, interfere, okay, the next move is this h2 move, but after g4, if black tries something like this to interfere with the bishop, well, now at least the rook is able to come over here to track down the pawn. So you would negate, by playing this e4 move, you would negate the bishop from controlling h1, but you're also interfering with the bishop controlling h7, which allows rook h7. So we didn't have that. After g4 is played, it was rook to h8. The rook plays back to d1, hitting the bishop, also watching over h1. Bishop to a2, we have a couple checks being thrown in again, which allows Karpov to pick up the e5 pawn. The bishop is still there to watch over h1. King takes, and after rook to e2, it is at this point that Kasparov resigns. There's not a good response at this point. What do? The bishop's hit, the pawn is hit. If the bishop moves, let's say here, you just grab the pawn. Fortunately, this rook had 2 jobs. It was overloaded, and you could grab on h2. If the recapture, we're just promoting with check. That's irrelevant, the checking part, but that's pretty much what we would have after rook to e2. These guys are forked. The bishop move, if the bishop were to move, if the game were to continue with the bishop moving, we would just grab on h2, and that'll be game over. So as it was in this game, after rook to e2, forking the bishop and the pawn, Kasparov is, of course, anticipating. Rook takes pawn here. There's no hope, and he ends up resigning. So that's all for this video. If we take just a quick look back, usually I just cut out right away, but if we just review very quickly, this is, again, touching on this early point, the strategic player, Karpov versus Kasparov, going into a quiet variation. If you're the more strategic type of player, this might not be a bad line to employ against, let's say, a dynamic opponent. Or if you're a dynamic opponent, maybe there's something more you could be doing instead of h6 or even entering this type of opening, the queen's gambit decline, this specific variation. So we had that investment early on. We had some of the tension here with c5. It's resolved. A very quiet position. Investing what? Investing the bishop pair in exchange for damaging the white pawn structure. It is at this point I went through, 5 things: material, space, time, pawn structure, king safety. The big thing in this one currently was pawn structure and the time, white having some time advantage here. Pawn structure is in black's favor. If white isn't not going to do something about it, making a move like this again would allow a very healthy pawn structure versus a not so healthy pawn structure on the white side. So white invests some time in exchange for damaging the black pawn structure. Now at this point, the biggest factor of that list of 5 would be time. And eventually, what did we see? We saw that converted quite nicely, that time advantage was converted into a material advantage, and the material advantage was eventually converted into a win. So some patience, some prep moves earlier with the bishop retreating, some prep moves, in other words, with f3. Eventually that pawn is picked up. We work on the king position, and this rook is just super active. White remains up a pawn. We could look at the material at this point. We could also look at the, I didn't point this out in the initial pass, but we could look at the material factor, of course, wiping up a pawn, but also just the activity level of both rooks, white having the more active rook. And eventually, as we saw, this is converted. A slight race here after one another obtains a passed pawn, the c pawn versus the a pawn. As it turns out, the white pawn is going to be the more active one, and it was converted like so. So again, this was right here the final position after rook to e2. Kasparov ends up resigning. So that's all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye.